The wind was a blade, sharp and relentless, honing itself against the granite peaks before descending to flay the last vestiges of warmth from her body. Snow, not the gentle, blanketing kind of fireside tales, but a fine, stinging dust, worked its way through the thin wool of her shawl. It was a shroud in the making. Alar lay where they had left her, curled into a hollow at the base of a skeletal pine. Her world had shrunk to the burning in her lungs and the profound encroaching numbness in her hands and feet. The cold was no longer an external force. It was a thief that had crept inside, stealing sensation, then hope. They had called it justice. Her brother-in-law, Jedediah, his face a mask of pious certainty, had pronounced the sentence. His words, frozen puffs of air in the biting cold, echoed in her mind more clearly than the howl of the wind. The mountain will judge you. God will have his due. They had not even looked back. Her husband's family, the people who had shared her table and warmed their hands at her hearth, had turned and walked away, their dark forms swallowed by the swirling white of the pass. They had left her to the judgment of the mountain, a judgment that was swift and without mercy. Her crime was widowhood. Her husband, Samuel, had been taken by a fever in the spring, and, in the eyes of his kin, her survival was an indictment. The land, her small plot with its sturdy cabin and fallow fields, was too valuable to be left in the hands of a lone woman they deemed unlucky at best and cursed at worst. It was easier to erase her. She tried to move, to fight, but her limbs were logs of ice, heavy and unresponsive. A tremor racked her frame, a final futile protest from a body surrendering its fight. The sky above was a sheet of pewter, indifferent. She thought of fire. The memory was so vivid it was almost painful. The crackle of pine logs, the dance of orange light on the rough-hewn walls of her home, the radiant heat that seeped into chilled bones. It was a world away now, a lifetime ago. Here, there was only the endless, consuming white and the deep, resonant cold that promised a final, dreamless sleep. Her breaths grew shallow, each one a tiny, sharp agony. Her eyelids, heavy with frost, began to droop. This is it, she thought, a strange calm settling over the terror. This is the end of me. The world was dissolving into a pale blur, the sound of the wind fading to a distant hum. But through the fading light, a shape emerged. It was dark and solid against the blizzard's chaos. A disruption in the seamless white. It was large, broader than any man she knew, and it moved with a steady, unhurried gait that seemed to mock the storm's fury. It was a trick of the failing light, she told herself, a phantom conjured by a dying mind. Yet it grew closer. It was a man, cloaked in heavy furs, his face obscured by a thick wild beard, and the angle of his head against the driving snow. He stopped a few feet from her, a silent, looming presence. She could not see his eyes, but she felt his gaze upon her, a palpable weight. There was no judgment in it, no pity she could discern, only a quiet, unnerving stillness. He knelt. The movement was slow, deliberate. He reached out a gloved hand, not to her, but to brush the snow from her face. The gesture was so unexpectedly gentle, it shattered her placid descent into darkness. A single hot tear escaped her eye, freezing instantly on her cheek. He said nothing. He simply gathered her into his arms. The world spun into a vortex of fur, the scent of pine and cold leather, and the shocking, solid strength of his hold. Then there was only blackness. She woke to the sensation of warmth, a feeling so foreign and profound it was almost painful. It was a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to be coaxing her back to life, one aching cell at a time. For a long moment, she simply lay there, adrift in the space between oblivion and consciousness, cataloging the return of sensation. The dull throb in her frost-nipped fingers and toes, the raw scrape in her throat, the heavy weight of wool blankets upon her. A fire crackled nearby, a gentle, rhythmic sound that was the antithesis of the screaming wind she last remembered. The air smelled of wood smoke, drying herbs, and something else, something savory and rich, that made her hollow stomach clench. She risked opening her eyes. The light was dim, filtered through a single, small window. covered in what looked like a thinly scraped hide, which glowed with the pale gray light of a storm-choked day. The cabin was small, a single room built of massive interlocking logs, chinked with moss and mud. The ceiling was low, hung with bundles of dried plants and strips of jerky. A stone hearth dominated one wall, the source of the life-giving heat, and by that hearth sat the man. He was as she remembered him from the snow, large, imposing, a creature of the wilderness itself. His back was to her. Chacks! He was stirring something in a black iron pot suspended over the flames. His clothes were worn leather and dark wool, practical and devoid of any ornament. His hair was long and dark, tied back with a simple leather thong. He moved with the same economy she had witnessed in the storm, no wasted motion, every action having a clear and simple purpose. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her newfound warmth. Where was she? Who was this man? A trapper? A hermit? Men who lived this far from civilization, who chose the silence of the peaks over the company of towns, were often spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. They were men who had a reason to be forgotten. He must have sensed her awakening. Without turning, his movements remained fluid and unhurried as he ladled some of the steaming liquid from the pot into a wooden bowl. He rose, and for the first time she saw his face clearly. It was a landscape of its own, weathered and stark as the mountains outside. His features were hard-angled, his brow heavy, and his beard, though trimmed, was thick and untamed. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, clear gray, the color of a winter sky after a storm, and they regarded her with an unnerving, direct neutrality. There was no malice in them, but no softness either. It was the gaze of a hawk, observant and unreadable. He crossed the small room in a few strides and stood beside the low cot where she lay. He did not speak. He simply held out the bowl. The steam rising from it carried the scent of rabbit and wild roots. It was the smell of life. Her body cried out for it, but her mind was a knot of fear and confusion. She could not find her voice. Her throat felt as if it were lined with sand. She tried to push herself up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and she fell back against the furs, a weak groan escaping her lips. The man's expression did not change. He knelt, setting the bowl on the packed dirt floor. With one powerful arm, he reached behind her, lifting her head and shoulders with surprising gentleness until she was propped against the log wall. He picked up the bowl again and held it to her lips. She hesitated for a heartbeat, her wild, frightened gaze locked on his. Then, the primal urge for survival, the deep animal need to live, overrode everything else. She parted her lips and accepted the broth. It was hot and rich, and it felt like liquid life flowing through her veins. He fed her slowly, patiently, until the bowl was empty. He took it away, set it by the hearth, and returned to his seat without a single word passing between them. He had saved her life, and he had not asked for a name, an explanation, or a word of thanks. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the hiss and pop of the fire. Ilara lay against the wall, the warmth of the broth spreading through her, and watched the silent man who had pulled her back from the edge of the grave. She did not know if she had been rescued or merely captured, if this was a reprieve or just a different kind of prison. The days that followed bled into one another, a slow, monotonous rhythm of survival dictated by the storm that raged outside. The wind shrieked, piling snow against the cabin until the hide-covered window was a mere sliver of gray light. Inside, the world was firelight and silence. Her rescuer, whom she began to think of as Silas, though she had no basis for the name other than the solid, earthy sound of it, moved through his routine with the predictability of a season. He tended the fire, his large, calloused hands arranging the logs with practiced care. He checked his snares, disappearing into the white fury for an hour each morning, and returning with a brace of rabbits or a ptarmigan, his beard and eyebrows caked in ice. He would skin and dress the game with a swift, brutal efficiency that was mesmerizing to watch. He worked on his hides, scraping them clean with a shard of rock, his muscles bunching and releasing under his leather tunic. He did all of this in a profound, unbroken silence. He never spoke to her. He never hummed or whistled. The only sounds he made were the sounds of his work, the thud of his axe splitting kindling, the scrape of his knife on wood, the soft tread of his moccasins on the dirt floor. At first, the silence was a terrifying void. It left too much room for her own thoughts, for the memories of Jedediah's face and the feel of the snow consuming her. She would lie on the cot, her body slowly mending, and watch him, searching his stoic profile for any hint of his intentions. His neutrality was a wall she could not penetrate. He fed her, he kept her warm, he changed the poultice of mashed herbs on her frostbitten fingers, his touch surprisingly deft. But he remained a stranger, a force of nature as unknowable as the mountain itself. Her fear began to curdle, slowly transforming into a deep and abiding curiosity. Who was this man who could live in such profound isolation? He seemed to need nothing from the world she had known. His cabin was a testament to his self-sufficiency. Every object had a purpose. The hand-carved spoons, the sturdy three-legged stool he sat on, the tightly woven baskets holding dried berries and roots. There was no clutter, no sentiment. It was a life stripped down to its barest essentials: shelter, warmth, food. As her strength returned, she began to find her own small place in that rhythm. She started by folding the furs on her cot each morning, a simple act of order in the Spartan room. He noticed. She was sure of it. A brief, almost imperceptible flick of his gray eyes toward her work was the only acknowledgement. It was enough. One afternoon while he was outside, she found his sewing kit, a bone needle in a spool of sinew, and mended a tear in the hem of her own thin dress. The stitches were small and uneven, her fingers still clumsy and stiff, but it was work. It was a purpose. When he returned, he glanced at the mended cloth, then at her. He gave a single, short nod. In their silent world, it felt like a paragraph of conversation. The day came when she felt strong enough to stand on her own. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, her bare feet pressing into the cold, hard-packed earth. The room tilted violently, but she steadied herself against the log wall, her knuckles white. He was by the fire, sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic sh-k, sh-hey, sh-hey of steel on stone, the only sound. He stopped. He watched her, his hands still. She took a shuffling step, then another. She made her way to the hearth, drawn by the heat, and sank onto a low bench carved from a single massive log. She was trembling from the effort, but a fierce pride warmed her from the inside. She had walked. She was not an invalid anymore. He resumed his sharpening, the familiar sound a comfort now. He had watched her struggle, had been ready to catch her. She knew, but he had allowed her to do it herself. He had given her the dignity of her own fight. She sat there for a long time, just watching the flames, feeling the strength slowly seep back into her weary limbs. She was a guest in this man's home, a life he had salvaged from the snow. And for the first time, she felt not like a prisoner of his silence, but a quiet participant in it. A week passed, then another. The storm broke, and brilliant, blinding sunlight streamed through the scraped window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The world outside was transformed into a pristine wilderness of white and blue. Ilara, now steady on her feet, began to explore the confines of her small world. End quote. She learned the cabin's secrets, the loose floorboard where he kept his tinderbox, the particular scent of the different herbs hanging from the rafters, the way the late afternoon sun cast a long shadow from the central support beam. She took over the cooking, learning to judge the right amount of water for the stew, to add the dried mushrooms and wild onions that gave it a deep, earthy flavor. He allowed her this responsibility without a word, simply eating the food she prepared from his wooden bowl. The first time she spoke, her voice was a shock in the quiet space. It was a dry, hoarse whisper, rusty from disuse. He had brought in a load of firewood, his arms piled high, and a small log tumbled off, rolling near her feet. She bent to pick it up. "Thank you," she rasped, holding it out to him. He stopped, his gaze dropping to the piece of wood in her hand, then lifting to her face. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his expression unreadable. She thought. Perhaps he was angry that she had broken some unspoken rule of his silent existence. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Then he took the log from her, added it to the pile by the hearth, and gave that same single, decisive nod he had given when she mended her dress. He did not reply. He did not need to. The exchange had happened, a bridge of 2 words built across the chasm of their silence. From then on, their interactions, though still sparse, began to form a language of their own. It was a language of gestures, of shared tasks, of quiet observation. When he saw her shivering, he placed another fur on her cot. When he noticed her wincing as she stretched her still healing fingers, he left a small pot of pungent salve by her bedside. She in turn learned to have hot broth ready for him when he returned from the traplines, to mend the small tears in his leather clothes before he had to ask to read the tension in his shoulders that told her a storm was coming. One evening he sat by the fire, not working, but simply staring into the flames. She watched him from her seat on the bench, the flickering light carving deep shadows into the planes of his face. He seemed troubled, his usual stoicism replaced by a deep, brooding stillness. On an impulse, she rose and refilled his empty mug with the hot, bitter tea she brewed from pine needles. She set it on the stool beside him. He did not look at her, but his large hand came up and closed around the warm wood of the mug. His fingers brushed against hers for a fleeting second. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the first time they had touched, for a reason other than necessity. He took a sip of the tea, the silence stretching between them thick and heavy. She retreated to her bench, her own hands trembling slightly. She was beginning to understand that his silence was not born of anger or ignorance. It was a choice. He was a man who had stripped his life of all that was unnecessary, and for him, words were often unnecessary. His actions, saving her, tending her, providing for her, allowing her the space to heal, spoke with more clarity than any platitude or promise. He lived in a world of truth, the brutal, honest truth of the mountain. And in that world, you were either alive or you were dead. You were either useful or you were a burden. He had seen her as something worth keeping alive. The question of why still lingered in the back of her mind, a persistent, unanswered echo. But now, another more pressing question began to form. What would happen when she was fully healed? Would he expect her to leave? The thought of returning to the world below, to the judgment and greed of men like Jedediah, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Here, in this silent cabin with this strange, quiet man, she felt safer than she had in years. She had been left for dead, but she was slowly, inexplicably beginning to feel like she was home. The quiet rhythm of their days was a balm, but it could not entirely erase the past. The memories came at night, in the deep silent hours when the fire burned low, and the only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. They were fractured images, sharp and painful as shards of glass. She would see Samuel's face, pale and slick with fever, his hand clutching hers. His last words had been her name, a breathless, questioning sound. Well, he had been a good man, gentle and kind, and his death had cleaved her life in two. Then the other faces would appear. Samuel's mother, her eyes cold and accusing, his brothers, their expressions, a mixture of pity and avarice. And always, Jedediah, the eldest, who had always looked at her with a thinly veiled resentment. He had coveted their small farm from the day Samuel inherited it. Samuel's death had not been a tragedy to him. It had been an opportunity. She remembered the meeting in the main house. The elders of the family gathered around the great oak table. She had stood before them, a lone woman in a black dress, and listened as Jedediah spun his poison. He spoke of blighted crops, of a cow that had gone dry, of the suddenness of Samuel's illness. He did not name her as a witch, not outright. The word was too dangerous. Instead, he used softer, more insidious terms. She was a bad omen, a vessel of misfortune. He twisted their grief into suspicion, their fear into blame. "She is not of our blood," he had said, his voice ringing with false piety. "She brought this sorrow to our door. The land will not thrive under her hand. It must be cleansed." No one had spoken for her. They had been swayed by his greed, masked as righteousness, or were too afraid to challenge him. The decision was swift. She would be cast out. Not into the settled lands where she might find aid or tell her story, but into the mountains. It was a death sentence, disguised as a pilgrimage. "Go to the high places," Jedediah had commanded, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "Make your peace with God. If he deems you worthy, he will provide." He and his younger brother had been the ones to escort her. They had given her no extra food, no warm cloak. They had taken her shawl, the last gift Samuel had given her, and tossed it at her feet as they reached the snow line. "The mountain will claim what's owed," he'd said, his final words to her. Lying on her cot in the mountain man's cabin, Alara would clench her fists, the phantom cold of that day seeping into her bones. The injustice of it burned like acid in her throat. They had not just left her to die, they had stolen her life, her home, her name. They had erased her. But they had failed. She was alive. A fierce, defiant anger began to smolder in her chest, a fire that burned brighter than any hearth. It was a clean, hot rage that cauterized the wounds of her grief and fear. Survival was no longer enough. She would not simply endure. She would become strong. She would learn this mountain that was meant to be her tomb. She would make it her own. This silent man, this Silas, had given her a chance. He had pulled her from the snow, but he could not carry her forever. She had to learn to walk on her own, not just across the cabin floor, but through this new wild life. The next morning, she woke with a new resolve. When Silas prepared to check his trap lines, she was waiting by the door, wrapped in a heavy fur he had given her. She had used sinew to fashion crude ties for her worn boots to keep the snow out. He stopped, looking at her, a question in his gray eyes. "I want to learn," she said, her voice clear and strong, with none of the rasping uncertainty of before. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing her strength, her determination. She met his look without flinching, her chin held high. She would not be denied. This was not a request, but a declaration. After a silence that stretched for a full minute, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. He turned and grabbed a smaller pair of snowshoes, fashioned from bent willow and hide, that had been leaning in a corner. He held them out to her. The lesson had begun. He never asked her why she was there, who had left her, or what she was running from. Her past was a story he did not need to hear. He saw only the woman who stood before him, a woman who had decided to live. The mountain became her teacher, and Silas her silent guide. He taught her not with words, but with actions. He showed her how to walk in the snowshoes, a shuffling, gliding motion that conserved energy. He pointed out the subtle indentations in the snow that marked the trail of a snowshoe hare, the claw marks on a pine that betrayed a porcupine's den. He taught her to identify the hardy winter plants, the tough, bitter bark of the willow that could be brewed into a tea for fevers, the frozen, wrinkled rose hips that held a surprising sweetness and fought off sickness. She was a quick study, her senses sharpened by necessity. She learned to read the sky, to know by the color of the clouds and the direction of the wind whether a storm was gathering in the high peaks. She learned the different calls of the birds, how the frantic chatter of a jay could signal a predator nearby. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to needlepoint and kneading dough, grew calloused and capable. She learned to set a snare, her fingers, though still stiff in the cold, becoming nimble enough to tie the intricate knots. The first time she caught a rabbit on her own, she felt a surge of pride so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. She carried it back to the cabin, her trophy, and prepared it herself. Silas watched her, and when she served him the stew that evening, he met her eyes across the fire and gave her one of his rare, almost imperceptible smiles. It was a small, fleeting thing, just a slight crinkling at the corners of his eyes, but it felt like the highest praise. Her old life faded, becoming a distant, painful memory, like a story that had happened to someone else. Inaya. The woman who had been cast out was being remade, forged anew in the crucible of the wilderness. The fear that had once been her constant companion was replaced by a quiet confidence. She no longer feared the silence. She had come to cherish it. It was a clean, honest silence, filled with the sounds of the living world, not the poisonous whispers of men. Her partnership with Silas deepened, settling into a comfortable, unspoken rhythm. They were two solitary creatures who had found a way to coexist, to support each other in the harsh beauty of their shared world. She learned his moods by the set of his jaw, his thoughts by the way he looked at the horizon. She knew, without him saying a word, when he was pleased with her progress, when he was worried about a coming storm, when he was simply content to sit by the fire in her company. She stopped wondering if he would ask her to leave. The cabin had become her home, its sturdy walls a fortress against the world that had rejected her. The thought of leaving now was unimaginable. Where would she go? What would she do? Every skill she had learned, every ounce of strength she had gained, belonged to this place. She belonged to this place. One day, as she was gathering firewood near a ridge overlooking the valley, she saw it. A thin curl of smoke, rising from the settlement below, from her old life. For a moment her breath caught in her throat. She saw the neat little farmsteads, the church spire, the winding road. It looked so small from up here, so fragile. There was no longing in her gaze, no nostalgia. There was only a cold, clear distance. She had been a part of that world, but it was no longer a part of her. Jedediah was down there, living in her house, tilling her fields. He probably thought her bones were picked clean by wolves. The thought brought not fear, but a grim satisfaction. Let him believe it. Let them all forget her. She had found a new life, a harder life, but a truer one. She turned her back on the valley and the smoke, her arms full of wood, and walked back to the cabin, to the fire, to the man who never asked why. Winter's grip began to loosen. The days grew longer, the sunlight holding a new, promising warmth. The snow, once deep and powdery, grew heavy and wet, and the sound of dripping water from the eaves of the cabin was a constant, gentle percussion. The mountain was waking from its slumber. With the thaw came a change in their routine. Silas spent more time away from the cabin, checking for signs of larger game emerging from hibernation, scouting the lower passes that were becoming accessible again. Alara managed the homestead, tending the fire, smoking the last of the winter meat, and preparing for the coming spring. The solitude didn't bother her. It was a comfortable, familiar state now. But she found herself watching the tree line in the late afternoon, waiting for the sight of his broad-shouldered form returning. His presence had become an anchor, a steady point in her new existence. One evening, a blizzard, one of winter's last angry gasps, descended upon the mountain. The wind howled with a renewed fury, and the snow fell so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet from the cabin door. It was a storm that forced intimacy, trapping them together in the small, firelit space. For days on end, they worked on indoor tasks. Silas repaired his snowshoes, painstakingly relacing the hide webbing. Alara sorted through her precious collection of dried herbs, her fingers carefully separating leaves and roots. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a shared space, as comfortable and familiar as the worn furs on her cot. On the second night of the storm, after their simple meal of smoked venison and rehydrated berries, Silas did something unusual. He took a small, pale piece of birchwood from his possibles bag and his sharpest knife. He sat on his stool by the fire, and in the flickering light he began to carve. Alara watched him, her own mending forgotten in her lap. His large, rough hands were surprisingly graceful, peeling away delicate curls of wood with practiced, precise movements. He was completely absorbed in his work, his brow furrowed in concentration. The cabin was filled with the soft, rhythmic scrape of the blade and the crackle of the fire. Hours passed. The storm raged outside, but inside, time seemed to slow, to pool around the small circle of firelight. Slowly, a shape began to emerge from the wood. It was a bird, a small, plump finch with its head cocked to one side, as if listening. The detail was astonishing. He carved the fine lines of its wing feathers, the delicate curve of its beak, the tiny, perfect claws. It was a creature of impossible delicacy, born from the hands of a man who seemed to be made of granite and leather. When he was finished, he ran his thumb over the smooth wood one last time, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. He did not look at her, did not present it with any fanfare. He simply rose and placed the small wooden bird on the rough stone of the mantelpiece. Nestled between a bundle of dried yarrow and a unique spiral-shaped rock, Then he returned to his stool and began to oil his hunting knife, as if nothing had happened. Ilara's heart ached with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than gratitude, deeper than affection. It was a profound sense of being seen. In his silent world, this was a poem. This was a declaration. The bird was not for him. His cabin was a place of utility, not decoration. It was for her. A small piece of beauty in their hard, Spartan life. A gift, with no occasion, no expectation of thanks. She rose and went to the mantelpiece. She picked up the bird, its weight almost nothing in her palm. The wood was impossibly smooth, still warm from his hands. She traced the delicate lines of the feathers with her fingertip. In that moment, she understood something essential about him. His silence wasn't an absence of feeling, but a different way of expressing it. He spoke through his actions, through his care, through the things he made. He had saved her body from the snow. But with this small, perfect bird, he was tending to something else entirely. He was tending to her soul. She did not thank him. Words would have felt clumsy, inadequate. Instead, she placed the bird back on the mantel, and when she turned, she met his eyes across the room. He was watching her, his gray gaze steady. She gave him a small, true smile, and he in return gave her a slow, solemn nod. It was a complete conversation, a perfect understanding. The storm could howl all it wanted. She was safe. She was home. The thaw came in earnest, and the mountain wept. Water trickled from every rock face, and the roar of the newly freed creeks filled the air. The world turned from white to brown and gray, the forest floor a sodden carpet of last year's leaves. It was a time of renewal, but also of danger. The softening snow could hide treacherous hollows, and the warming earth could release sudden rockfalls. Silas grew more watchful, his gaze often sweeping the valley below. Ilara, too, felt a strange disquiet, a sense of foreboding that clung to the damp air. The peace they had built felt fragile, as if the melting snows might reveal the ugliness of the world they had hidden from. One afternoon, Silas returned from a long scouting trip early. He moved without his usual deliberate calm. There was a tension in his stride, a grim set to his mouth. He did not put away his gear or stoke the fire. He came straight to her where she sat scraping a hide near the cabin door. "Tracks," he said. The single word was like a stone dropped into a still pond. It was the most he had spoken, at one time since her arrival. "Not animal," he continued, his voice a low rumble. "Two men, shod horses. Coming up from the valley, they're following the thaw line." Ilara's blood ran cold. She did not need to ask who it was. She knew. Jedediah. The spring would have revealed her absence, confirmed her disappearance. Perhaps he was coming to claim some imagined hunting ground, or perhaps, with the passes clearing, he had come to ensure his crime remained buried. He was coming to make sure she was truly gone. The fear she thought she had conquered returned a familiar sickening lurch in her stomach. But this time, it was different. It was not the passive terror of a victim, but the sharp, cold fury of a survivor whose sanctuary was threatened. This cabin, this mountain, this life, they were hers now. She had earned them. She would not let him take them from her. She looked at Silas, expecting to see a reflection of her own alarm, but his face was a mask of cold resolve. There was no fear in his eyes, only a dangerous, predatory stillness. He was a territorial creature, and his territory had been invaded. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "You are not the woman I found in the snow," he stated, not as a question but as a fact. It was an acknowledgement of her strength, a testament to her transformation. "They will not take you." His words were a simple, solid promise. There was no plan discussed, no strategy laid out. There was no need. He moved with quiet purpose, checking the edge on his axe, placing a full quiver of arrows by the door. He was preparing for a different kind of hunt. Ilara, drawing strength from his calm, went about her own preparations. She barred the heavy wooden shutter over the window. She banked the fire so it would give off heat, but little smoke. She took the largest kitchen knife and tucked it into the waistband of her skirt. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence in the cabin was heavy, charged with anticipation. Every gust of wind, every snap of a twig outside, sent a jolt through her. They sat in the dim light, he on his stool, she on the bench, two silent figures, braced for a storm of a different kind. The sun began to set, painting the sliver of sky visible above the shutter in hues of orange and purple. And then they heard it. The sound of a horse whinnying. Too close, the crunch of boots on the damp, thawing earth. A man's voice, rough and familiar. "Jedediah, there's a cabin here. Looks lived in." Jedediah's reply was sharp, filled with arrogant disbelief. "Nonsense. No one lives this high. It's an old trapper's lean-to." The footsteps came closer. A heavy fist hammered on the door. "Hello! Anyone in there?" Ilara's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Silas. He raised a hand, a silent command to wait. The hammering came again, more insistent this time. Then Jedediah's voice, laced with impatience. "Enough of this. Stand aside." There was a grunt, and the heavy wooden door shuddered as a shoulder slammed against it. It held the bar. Silas had carved from a seasoned oak was strong. A furious curse came from outside, followed by the sound of them backing away. Ilara knew what was coming next. The door splintered near the latch as the butt of a rifle slammed into it. Again and again, the wood groaned, protesting, then gave way with a sickening crack. The door swung inward, and Jedediah stood there, silhouetted against the dying light, a rifle in his hands. Jedediah stumbled into the dim cabin, his eyes wide, trying to adjust to the gloom. His companion, a hulking man from the village named Thomas, followed close behind. When Jedediah's gaze fell on Ilara, his face contorted into a mask of pure shock, then curdled into rage. "You," he breathed the word, a venomous hiss, "alive." He looked around the small, orderly cabin, at the smoldering fire, the furs on the cot. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the frail, weeping woman he had abandoned, but someone else. Her clothes were worn but clean, her hair was tied back neatly, and she stood with a straightness to her spine he had never seen before. She held a knife in her hand, and there was no fear in her eyes, only a cold, hard loathing. "Impossible," he snarled, raising his rifle. "The mountain was supposed to claim you." "The mountain provides for its own," Ilara said, her voice ringing with a strength that startled them both. Before Jedediah could respond, a shadow detached itself from the darkest corner of the cabin. Silas moved with a fluid, unnatural speed. He was not the slow, deliberate man of the hearth. He was a predator. He crossed the room in two silent strides, his large hand closing around the barrel of Jedediah's rifle. Jedediah, startled, tried to pull the weapon back, but it was like trying to wrestle with an oak tree. With a single sharp twist of his powerful wrists, Silas tore the rifle from Jedediah's grasp. The crack of the stock breaking echoed in the small space. He tossed the useless pieces of wood and metal aside as if they were kindling. Thomas, seeing his leader disarmed, let out a roar and charged, his own knife drawn. It was a foolish, clumsy attack. Silas met the charge, not with force, but with a brutal, efficient grace. He sidestepped, his arm shooting out to lock around Thomas's throat, using the man's own momentum to slam him into the log wall. The sound of Thomas's head hitting the wood was a sickening thud. The big man crumpled to the floor, dazed and groaning. It was over in seconds. Jedediah stood, unarmed and shaking, staring at the mountain man who now stood between him and Ilara. Silas was a terrifying figure in the dim light, his face grim, his silence more menacing than any threat. He was the mountain incarnate, implacable, powerful, and unforgiving. Jedediah's arrogance crumbled, replaced by a primal fear. "Who? What are you?" he stammered. Silas did not answer. He simply took a step toward him. Jedediah scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet and falling to the dirt floor. He looked at Ilara, his eyes pleading. "Ilara, please!" We thought you were." "It was a mistake." "It was not a mistake," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a shard of ice. She stepped forward, standing beside Silas, the two of them a united, unbreachable front. She was no longer hiding behind him. She was standing with him. "You judged me. You condemned me. You left me to die." She took another step, her gaze pinning him to the floor. "Now, I am giving you my judgment. You will leave this mountain." You will never return. You will tell everyone that Alara died in the winter. My home is yours. My name is yours to tarnish. I want none of it. My life here is my own." Jedediah stared at her, at the woman he had tried to erase, now pronouncing his own sentence. He saw no mercy in her face, only a final, irrevocable severance. Silas bent down and hauled the groaning Thomas to his feet. He shoved both men toward the broken door. "Go," he said, his voice a low growl, the first and only word he spoke to them. They stumbled out into the twilight, Jedediah casting one last, terrified look over his shoulder. Silas followed them out. He watched as they scrambled onto their horse and galloped away, their retreat clumsy and panicked. He stood there for a long time, a silent guardian in the doorway, until the sound of their flight had completely faded, swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The threat was gone. The mountain was quiet again. The only sounds were the whisper of the evening breeze through the pines and the steady drip of melting snow. The air smelled clean, washed by the coming night. Silas turned from the doorway and came back inside. He looked at the shattered door, then at Alara. She stood in the center of the room, the knife still clutched in her hand, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. He gently took the knife from her fingers and set it on the small table. His hand then came up and rested on her shoulder, a solid grounding weight. It was a gesture of comfort, of acknowledgement, of partnership. She looked up at him into those clear gray eyes. The question that had lived in the back of her mind for months, the one she had never dared to ask, now felt trivial. Its power dissolved. Why had they left her? The reasons, greed, fear, cruelty, seemed so small and distant now. They belonged to a world she no longer inhabited. The more important question had always been the one he never asked. He had found a half-frozen woman in a blizzard, a stranger on the brink of death, and he had brought her into his home. He had nursed her, protected her, and taught her, all without a single inquiry into the circumstances that had brought her to his path. He had never asked why they did it. He had never needed to. The reason for their cruelty did not matter. What mattered was her humanity. To him, she was not a curse or an omen or a problem to be disposed of. She was simply a person in need of help. In his stark, clear world, that was reason enough. His silence had not been indifference. It had been the ultimate form of acceptance. He had accepted her without a past, without a story, allowing her to become the person she was meant to be, not the one others had tried to make her. "It's over," she whispered, the words tasting of relief and finality. He nodded, his hand still on her shoulder. Yes, they stood like that for a long moment in the quiet, firelit cabin. The broken door was a testament to the battle they had won, a symbol of the final severing of her old life. Tomorrow, they would repair it. They would make it stronger than before, together. She was no longer Alara, Samuel's widow, the outcast. That woman had died in the snow. She was a woman of the mountain, forged in silence and survival. Her past was a ghost, and her future was here, in this small cabin, with this quiet, steadfast man. He had not just saved her life, he had given her a new one. A life where her worth was not determined by others but by her own strength and resilience. A life where words were scarce, but understanding was absolute. He finally dropped his hand and moved to the hearth, adding a fresh log to the embers. The flames caught, flaring up to push back the gathering darkness, filling the room with warmth and a steady, hopeful light. Alara watched him, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. She picked up the small wooden bird from the mantelpiece, its smooth, familiar shape, a comfort in her palm. The storm was over. The spring had truly come.